Today we're going to talk about avian influenza, more specifically the people it impacts, the birds that it infects, and the environmental impacts that it might have on our world around us. Before we can talk about avian influenza specifically, we need to talk a little bit about some basic virology. Every virus is composed of a membrane, some nuclear material, and on the outside of the membrane, two protein substrates that help to identify that virus. The first is a hemagglutinin, which we call these H types, and every virus can have up to 18 H types, which help to identify it. The second type of protein substrate on the outside of a virus is a neuraminidase, and we just call these N types. And basically, a virus is composed of a certain amount of H types and N types, and we use this to be able to identify what virus we're talking about. So for avian influenza, it is H5N1. That's the virus we're talking about. Some other examples of viruses that you might be familiar with are the 2009 H1N1, or more commonly known as the swine flu. So what is avian influenza exactly? Well, we said it was H5N1, but to be a little bit more specific, it's H5N1 type A. There's three distinct strains, A, B, and C, and type A is the one we're focused on because it has a lot of virulence factors. We can also classify avian influenza as highly pathogenic or lowly pathogenic, and HPAI, or highly pathogenic avian influenza, is pretty much synonymous with H5N1 type A because of their virulence factors. If we look to the map on the right, we can see that the start of the infection is predominantly Asia, Europe, and Africa. And in these countries, we can see a lot of HPAI between wildfowl and domesticated birds. A key aspect of avian influenza is that it's very different from seasonal influenza. Avian influenza is one that was started in the avian species, whereas the normal human seasonal influenza is one that comes each fall and spring and goes throughout the entire human population. So, who's at risk of avian influenza? Well, like we were just saying, that there's a couple of different vectors for the transmission of the virus. Two key vectors are wildfowl in nature and birds that we've domesticated for use in agricultural purposes. Because the virus is spread through any bodily secretions, the nostrils, mouth, eyes, and the feces, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, it makes it very easy for the virus to spread from one wild bird to a domesticated bird. Or since we were just talking about how it was spread, we can talk about why avian influenza is so dangerous. We were saying that it can be spread from birds to people, and that makes it a zoonotic disease, any disease that's spread from animals to people. The problem with avian influenza or bird flu is that it has similar initial symptoms to our seasonal flu. So you might not realize you have bird flu until it's too late. And some of these too late symptoms include primary viral pneumonia, which means that your respiratory system basically shuts down, and then you start to have multi-organ failure, which is a very, very bad thing, and then ultimately. So a couple slides ago we said that the virus can be excreted in the feces, and this should put off a couple light bulbs in your head really quickly. So in the agricultural industry, we use poultry litter very commonly as a fertilizer, and we can use it as a feed grade additive. And when a virus is able to be excreted in the feces, that means that it could be potentially transmitted to other things, being animals or people that are working with these products. And so that is a very big concern. The next big problem with avian influenza is, what do we do with all these dead birds? We could put them in a mass grave, but there's going to be a lot of problems with that, and some of these problems include actually leaching the virus directly into the waterways, spread of disease if predators come and take a carcass that could pick up the virus and spread it that way, and all around just a bad odor. What about incineration? We could try burning all the dead birds, but is that really the most environmentally effective way of taking care of all these dead birds? So what is the solution? As you can see below, it's composting, and the USDA has decided that composting, whether it be within the turkey house or outside, is the best method for handling birds that have died from. So after doing some research, I found out that making a compost stack or windrow is really an art form, as weird as that sounds. The USDA came up with a couple of recommendations before people start to compost, and one of those includes a composting expert. Others include having trained equipment operators and sufficient space for all the carbon, water, and litter that you have to handle to make the compost work. They also recommended that the ideal location be near the infected area because the virus can spread even just from loading the litter onto a truck and transporting it down the road. It needs to be a biosecure area, and as I mentioned before, void of scavengers, because we would be really shooting ourselves in the foot if a fox or coyote came and grabbed a carcass and hauled it out in the woods and it infected a bunch of. As I mentioned before, making the composting windrows is somewhat of an art form. Before we talk about the specifics of how they're layered, I'll give you some statistics. Normally they're 6 to 8 feet tall, about 12 to 15 feet wide, and usually run the length of a poultry house. A key aspect of making the composting windrow is maintaining a 1-to-1 carbon to carcass ratio, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute. And another aspect that is very important to the windrow is trying to maintain 131 degrees Fahrenheit for 72 hours, which is important for making sure that the virus is completely degraded. So as I mentioned before, there's three parts of the windrow that really are the vital aspects. To start off with, we have a base that's usually 10 to 15 inches thick, and it's composed of thick wood chips or a mulch that isn't pressed down. It's able to let air up into the core to help oxidize and break down the carcass and the compost. And so talking about the core, like I said, a 1-to-1 carbon to carcass ratio, and normally the carbon is adequately supplied from the litter that normally is in the poultry houses, so they're able to get rid of the litter at the same time that they're getting rid of the birds. Something I didn't know was that they needed to make sure that they get rid of any of the feed that was left over, because that can be a vector of transport to other farms too, so they'll go ahead and put the feed in the core as well. The cap is honestly the most important part because it helps to let water and heat out as well as carbon dioxide, which kind of facilitates the breakdown of everything inside and really makes sure that all the goodies are being taken care of the way they need to, and as well as keeping the smell under control and keeping predators and flies away as well. This is an image out of the USDA APHIS Composting 101, and I just found it really interesting that there can be a lot of things that can go wrong, and they have solutions to how to fix it and make sure that you're maintaining your composting windrow to the best it can be at all times. And just learning that there's a USDA APHIS made it very clear that there's some environmental constraints around making composting windrows, and the key concern revolves around leaching. And leaching is basically whenever nutrients that are not wanting to get into a waterway and impact that ecosystem negatively. And so some of the environmental constraints that surround making windrows include keeping the windrow away from drinking water at least 200 feet, and this includes any water used for livestock or residential purposes. Maintaining at least 200 feet away from bodies of water, such as rivers, lakes, streams, ponds, and 200 feet away from residents, which is a very important aspect, and I think that's pretty obvious why the odor. And then two other aspects include keeping them 50 feet away from drainage swales, which it makes it a little bit more difficult for farmers if they have drainage swales on their farms, and then 25 feet away from drainage swales that don't run into water. So in conclusion, there's been few H5N1 infections in the US, which is a really good thing, and I think that's partly in part of the fact that the US prohibits imports from countries that have poultry that have been infected with H5N1 type A. And I think it's really interesting that it has united a lot of different organizations such as the CDC and the USDA and amongst other organizations trying to fight against the infection of H5N1 in the United States. That's all I've got. Thanks for listening, and I hope you learned something great about avian